These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits.
C 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University. Welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, an exploration of the language and praxis of decolonization through the reclamation of land and dignity in South Africa's shack dwellers and landless movements with Dr. Yousuf Al-Bulushi, and a look at the recent general strike in Buenaventura, Colombia with human rights activist Charo, Mina, Rojas. Africa World Now Project is next. Frantz Fanon's 1961 treatise on the dehumanizing effects of colonization on the psyche and material landscapes of the colonized, the wretched of the earth, provides a discerning articulation on the processes of decolonization. In The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon writes, "Decolonization never goes unnoticed. It infuses a new rhythm specific to a generation of men, with a new language and a new humanity. Decolonization is truly the creation of a new man, but such a creation cannot be attributed to a supernatural power. The thing colonized becomes a man through the very process of liberation. However, the process of decolonization has yet to reach full expression. The language and praxis of decolonization, the promise of a radical humanism and a new relation of being in the world remain severely arrested. If decolonization was an intentional and direct response to colonialism, decolonization failed in uprooting the colonial repressive systems on a mass scale. For Fanon, the colonial world is a compartmentalized world, a world divided in two. The dividing line, the border, an idea the Bois names the color line, the poverty line, a siphoning of the world's resources into the hands of a few, and securitized by barracks, the police station, drones, the banks, private interest and capital. In the past 20 years throughout the African world as well as the global south, burgeoning social movements constituting what Sylvia Wynter describes as the vast majority of peoples who inhabit the favela, shantytown of the globe, and their jobless archipelagos, Baldwin's captive population in the urban inner cities, have reinvigorated and expanded the arena and language of grassroots politics and political action. We see this in particular with the youth movements of the Roads Must Fall, These Must Fall, which calls into question the deep racial, economic, social, and political inequalities in a so-called post-apartheid South Africa. We see this more clearly with the Black First, Land First, which invokes the Fanon postulation that for a colonized people, the most essential value, because it is the most concrete, is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread and above all, dignity. Today we will deeply engage with the language and praxis of decolonization through one of the most important land and dignity movements in South Africa, the Durban Shack Dwellers movement. The history of the shack dwellers conveyed the necessity of the movement, which began in Durban in early 2005. Despite being overwhelmingly located in and around the large port city in terms of mobilization, it is the largest organization of the militant poor in post-apartheid South Africa. Its origins are found in a roadblock organized from the Kennedy Road settlement in protest to the sale of a piece of nearby land long promised by the local municipal councilor to shack dwellers for housing. The movement grew quickly and now has tens of thousands of supporters from more than 30 settlements. It developed a sustained voice for shack dwellers in subaltern and elite publics, and occupied and marched on the offices of local councilors, police stations, municipal offices, newspaper offices, and city hall in actions that have put thousands of people on the streets. Amongst victories, they have democratized the governance of many settlements, stopped evictions in a number of settlements, won access to schools, stopped the industrial development of the land promised to communities, forced numerous government officials, offices, and projects to come down to the people. The movement's key demand is for land and housing in the city, but it has also successfully politicized and fought for an end to forced removals and for access to education and the provision of water, electricity, sanitation, healthcare, and refuse removal, as well as bottom-up popular democracy. Today we will explore the language and praxis of decolonization through the reclamation of land and dignity in South Africa's shack dwellers and landless movements with Dr. Yousuf Al-Bulushi, an assistant professor of peace studies at Gosher College in Baltimore, Maryland. Our show was produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all people. Enjoy the program. Let's jump right into this very, very important topic that we are covering today, and this is part of a series that the program has been doing, and I think is an important question within the context of access to land and the right to housing and a reclamation of human dignity as an intersection or a cohesive component in those. Can you discuss the importance of social movements in facilitating the access to land, the right to housing, and the reclamation of human dignity among vulnerable and marginalized communities in South Africa?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think that part of what's unique about bringing social movements to the foreground of questions of the right to housing and land is that it grounds the story in the experiences of everyday people, rather than in those who may have gained access to power or have become notable for their participation in movements. So historically in South Africa, the biggest moment of land dispossession came in the early 20th century with the Native Land Act that dispossessed the indigenous populations of South Africa of approximately 90% of the land and the best land. So already there had been a colonial presence in the country, and people had been resisting displacement from their land. So we can't neglect that. There's a long tradition of these kinds of social movements. But the most famous movements come about later in the 20th century, and the most paradigmatic is obviously the anti-apartheid movement. While many people remember the anti-apartheid movement as being about overthrowing a racist government first and foremost, its racism was really made material in large part through dispossession of land and through geographical divisions that were put in place throughout the country. So in a sense, any and all of those anti-apartheid movements were also movements that had to place at their forefront the question of land and the right to housing and the right to a dignified life. Since the end of apartheid, since that government was overthrown in the early 1990s, there was a period of transition between 1990 and 1994, which I'm sure is familiar to your listeners. The democratic government has come about, and the ANC, the African National Congress, has been in charge. What's interesting here is that, as is the case in many former colonies, this was a moment of transition between the ANC being a social movement and the ANC becoming a powerful governmental actor. And like in many other parts of Africa and other parts of the world, this has entailed a slowing down and a problematization of the direction of that movement. Mandela was the first leader in South Africa, in democratic South Africa in the 1990s. And even though people held out a lot of hope for his government, by the end of his government in 1999, really people realized that the promises of the anti-apartheid movement had not yet been fulfilled. And one of those central promises was the question of land and housing. So beginning in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, a whole new round of social movements emerged. And once again, the question of land and housing was central in these movements. The fact that even though they lived in a democratic government, the African National Congress was now in power, people still lacked access to land and housing, and they felt like the objectives of the anti-apartheid struggle had not yet been met. So it's really been those movements that have brought to the fore, once again, these questions at a time when the government has either been unwilling to do so or found itself unable to do so from above. So, in brief, I would say that's one of the most important things that a social movement can do in the South African context, which is carry that torch forward of the liberation struggle and point out the ways in which liberation has not yet been achieved, and how the struggle for land and housing is something that the movements both continue to demand but also enact, right, through land occupations and setting up of their own communities, often shack communities in the country.
Mm-hmm. Which we're going to get to specifically, because we're going to look at the shack dwellers movement.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get there, I mean, you're raising some important questions here. We're talking about the idea of power being replaced or being removed and being replaced by another group of individuals or people, which of course is within the context of the nature of social movements. What is the nature of the idea of the nation state in constructing social, economic, and political relations in the context of after a movement has seized power or has moved within the context of trying to reorder society? Because this becomes very, very important, because of course we know here in South Africa we're looking at the youth movements, we're looking at the different things that are going on. What is the relationship between, that contestation of constructing society based upon the idea of the nation state from a European perspective being superimposed on an indigenous people who have a certain level of understanding of their relationship to land as well?
Yeah, that's an important question, and I think we could address it from any number of angles. Certainly, the nation state, the way that we understand it today, is understood as a European phenomenon emerging in the 1600s and 1700s, and then once decolonization sets in, and third world countries assert their right to self-determination, they break from European powers and they adopt this model of the nation state. And it's something that we don't problematize enough, in part because it wasn't a predestined outcome of the anti-colonial struggles. In fact, some members of these anti-colonial struggles were questioning the platform, the movement platform that was most places insisting upon the nation state as the model of self-determination. Some, like Aimé Césaire, were calling for remaining within a broader federation of the former colonial powers rather than the right to their own nation state as the path to freedom. And even though at the time that was seen as a kind of regressive position, in the sense that people thought it conceded too much to these European powers. How will we determine our own destiny if we remain within this broader configuration, but even if now as equals? In retrospect, it seems clear that the adoption of the nation state as a model for self-determination has been inadequate, to say the least. It has facilitated the ongoing nature of coloniality through a whole range of forms of neocolonialism, which, perhaps most prominently, Frantz Fanon identified already in the early 1960s, right? He was arguing that merely adopting the nationalism and the nation state as a path to liberation would lead to a whole set of problems. Foremost among them, perhaps, was the emergence of a kind of national bourgeoisie who now would take control of the independent government, this new nation state, but continue to rule kind of on behalf of the former colonizers, to be the middlemen, so to speak, between the former colonizers and the indigenous population, and who would focus everything around the idea that if this newly independent and supposedly democratic nation state was being ruled by representatives of the indigenous population, then that was meant that the indigenous populations themselves was free. And that clearly has not been the case. Instead, it's led to the enrichment of that particular minority class of the indigenous population at the expense, most often, of the vast majority of its inhabitants. So the nation state itself is problematic for that global geopolitical framing of how self-determination might be achieved, but then also domestically because it always relies upon a political logic of representation. All you have to do to achieve freedom and self-determination is to elect a representative, in this case, the African National Congress, who will then represent you within the government and take decisions on your behalf. As we know, that structure of representation has broken down, not just in South Africa, but in many other parts of the world. And so it's social movements who are reactivating the question of democracy beyond kind of liberal electoral democracy that the nation state often relies upon, but once again posing it as a grassroots question, as a question of dignity, of the self-activity of everyday people in their lives. And that, once again, questions, I think, the traditional model of the nation state as a political unit that is supposed to meet our needs.
So, I mean, again, you're raising, we talked about power, the replacement of, and I'm just recapping here because, I mean, this conversation is moving in a certain direction because, again, you mentioned the objectives of the struggle. You mentioned how the objective of the struggle did not necessarily filter down to the indigenous people, the indigenous movements, and how this idea of decolonization, of course, in academic circles, we look at that in a historic instance, right? We look at that as a historic instance, but we know that decolonization is a process. And when you look at the reality on the ground, we know that decolonization is not filtered all the way down. And so the reason why we're talking about this, of course, is because the movement in the grassroots, we have the shack dwellers, a movement that is in South Africa right now that is kind of, taking up this mantle of, or taking up or reconceptualizing or reinvigorating the conversation of decolonization, moving into the conversation between material objectives and ideological objectives. How do we merge them? As opposed to saying, well, no, we need just material objectives are going to get us where we need to go without the ideological, or some people saying, no, we need the ideological. So my question, this leads to the question of what is the impact of the Black consciousness movement in localized struggles for land in the 21st century? And the second part of that is what types of indigenous knowledge is being produced from these movements, specifically when we're moving into the shack dwellers movement, because I know you do a lot of work with them, and their spatial practices, because we have an ideological. How do we get there, right? How do we reassess where we're at today? And of course, this becomes a very, very important question because this is a model that we can look at across the world.
Yes. Well, first with the Black consciousness movement, precisely in these moments when one paradigmatic, well-known representative of the liberation struggle, the anti-apartheid struggle, the ANC, gains power, and then is met with a whole series of challenges and unable or unwilling to follow through on the kind of demands of the liberation struggle, there's often a revisiting of those alternative currents in the anti-apartheid struggle. And perhaps the most important of the alternative currents of struggle include the Black consciousness movement. And so it's had a rebirth, in a sense, after the end of apartheid. And principally, I would say it's the question of race and the persistence of anti-Blackness in a post-apartheid or purportedly post-apartheid moment that has brought to the fore that tradition of the Black consciousness movement. It's for groups who I think have found themselves really facing what seems to be a constricting and limiting discourse around race in South Africa that privileges the idea of non-racialism as a means of combating racism. And this has been limiting for a whole variety of factors. The idea of non-racialism, that we should try to overcome the categories of race, both in terms of the structures of power we're resisting, but also in terms of how we organize ourselves. We shouldn't see it, we shouldn't use it as a category in our organization, has, I think, faced tremendous limitation. And its worst form, it operates as a kind of color blindness in South Africa. And so for communities who are continuing to struggle for justice, for dignity, for housing, for land, I think they've realized all along that part of the basis of their dispossession has been the ongoing nature of anti-Black racism in the country. And while it may be perceived as unfashionable to continue to talk about racism when you have a Black government, these groups have been arguing that obviously that structure of oppression that was in place under the colonial period and the apartheid period, that was a racist structure, was not fully overthrown, clearly. And in that context, they wanted to take recourse to the ideas of the Black consciousness movement that were kind of placing at the forefront the limitations of white organizers in the anti-apartheid struggle, the ways in which white activists often took over the platform, the agenda, and the kind of representation of the struggle, and the need to form a self-determining organization that would speak for Black people. And in the context of South Africa, the idea of Blackness that was being mobilized by Steve Biko and other members of the Black consciousness movement included the Indian and the colored communities, in addition to the indigenous African population. So that meant that as an affirmative political category of identity, Blackness encompassed all non-white communities, not just the indigenous African community, but also the Indian and colored communities. So it was a way of foregrounding the question of race, the limitations of white activists, and the need for a Black space and a Black political organization to confront racism in the country. In the current moment, over the last 2 decades, the Biko has been read, and the ideas of Black consciousness have been read by a whole range of groups, including the Shack Dwellers movement, and they've been used as a way of pointing out the limitations of a certain dominant narrative of the anti-apartheid struggle, as though this was just about the ANC. No, there were other groups. The students were actively involved, especially in Black consciousness. And they've been used as a way of addressing another part of your question, which is the role of ideas and consciousness in the struggle. The need to fully continue tackling a colonized intellectual environment, structure, university, and mindset. And the need to decolonize our mind is an ongoing project that Black consciousness really put forward. So Black consciousness ideas have been really important for the student movement in South Africa as well, in this context that has really emerged anew in the last couple of years. And they've also penetrated the grassroots struggles of people fighting for land, who understand that being dispossessed from land was never simply about whether you were oppressed or a member of the working class, but it was fundamentally about being assigned a racial identity that then justified, created the basis to justify the dispossession of that land, right? Being assigned the category of Black, of African, of Indian, of colored. And in addition to that, for the Shack Dwellers, the Black consciousness movement, I think, has been important because Black consciousness often argued that the mere delivery of material goods, let's say land and housing, would not necessarily provide you with liberation, right? Mm-hmm. You had to have control over your mind, over your ability to understand the world, and over your ability to produce dominant ideas in the world. And so this is where the question of dignity, I think, comes in for movements like the Shack Dwellers, who are arguing often against certain dominant representations of social movements and shack communities today that say, well, these people just want electricity. They just want sanitation. They just want a house. And therefore, if we can develop the technical solutions to these problems and deliver them from above through the government or through nonprofit organizations or via experts, then their demands will be satisfied. But I think in part in conversation with this Black consciousness movement, the shack dwellers have been insisting upon the limits of that framework for understanding their movement. And while they're extremely attentive to the material demands that they face, that their communities face, the need for electricity, the need for actual houses, and they're extremely cognizant of the violent effects of not having access to those things, they also argue consistently that can never encompass all of the demands of their movement, that really the central demand of the struggle is one for dignity. And dignity is really an idea that can't be delivered from above through technocratic instruments like the local government or nonprofit organization. So that would be kind of part of how the Black consciousness movement has been important. There's many other ways as well, including, I would say, in a new electoral movement, the economic freedom fighters, which we can talk about a little bit later if you want. But I wanted to touch on your second question, if you can remind me.
This is perfect because I wanted to kind of, you laid it out very, very systematically, and let's dig a little bit deeper and look at what are some of the ways that the shack dwellers and landless movements are reimagining space and place. Again, I think you're making this very, very important point. Those who are in power will say, just give them electricity, and they'll go away. But that's not all that's there, because there's other things that these groups and these movements are doing to create community and reimagining space, looking at place, looking at the importance, because dignity is something that can be transferred from generation to generation, and it creates an identity, a relationship between not only people in these spaces or in these communities, but also to the environment. And also we can get into larger conversations of the universe as well. So what are some of the ways that they're doing this? I know there's some cultural events and things that they're doing along with their movements and with their demands.
Yeah. Well, first, just on space and place, this is a great question. As you know, I'm a geographer, so I think a lot about these things, but the movement does as well. And usually, although this is a limiting understanding, space is understood as more of an abstract concept, something that's mathematical, something that you can measure, and place is often discussed as something that is more tangible, more concrete, more a question of your experience in a particular place, in the kind of phenomenological sense. And I think the shack dwellers are making interventions on both of these fronts, as you point out. First, with regards to the abstract conception of space, we can think of the formal divisions under apartheid and under colonialism before apartheid between a white city and a rural Black homeland in the countryside, right? The proper place for an indigenous African, according to colonial and apartheid ideas, was in the countryside, right, on these supposedly rural homelands. And so by moving into the city, by transgressing the boundaries already under apartheid, which is when these shack communities really began to grow, this was a kind of active disavowal of that division, refusal to recognize it, and a claiming of a right to the city in general by moving from the countryside into the city itself. Secondly, I think the shack dwellers really have shifted the most prominent place for politics historically. I think especially in a country where the Communist Party has remained quite dominant, where Marxism remained alive for quite a long time and continues to be an important framework for seeing the world, oftentimes more restricting understandings of the Marxist political movement focused on the factory as the preeminent place for politics. And what the shack dwellers have done is shift, enhance, and kind of enlarge that positioning of politics from beyond the factory walls into the community setting, into the home, right? The home is supposedly a personal place. It's supposed, and traditionally, even according to, let's say, Aristotle, it's a private place. So that's not where politics takes place. Politics takes place in the public sphere. But the shack dwellers have highlighted the home as a central site of contestation with the state in all of its complexity. And they've brought to the foreground the fact that the particular places that shack dwellers are forced to inhabit in post-apartheid cities are extremely vulnerable to things such as fires, to private hit squads, to state repression, to neglect, to economic disenfranchisement, to a whole range of health problems, including HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis. And because of those vulnerabilities, those particular places have been kind of erased from the public mindset until they move up against middle-class neighborhoods that often speak derisively of them, speak of them as threatening, and speak of them in terms of the need to yet again displace these problems of shack communities. Most commonly, the government or local communities proposes displacing them yet again to the outlying fringes of the city where the government might be promising them homes or might relocate them to transit camps, temporary camps, under quite horrific conditions. So I would say those are the two ways in which the movement has really brought about the question of space and place. And then they also are affirming that shack communities, despite all their problems, are not simply places filled with problems. They're communities. They're actually communities, and they're communities that are built every day anew. They're sites of celebrations, of festivals. So one of the things that Abahlali does whenever they gather is kind of recognize those more affirming aspects of what it means to live in a shack community. Every year when they organize on Freedom Day, they organize down on one of the big soccer fields in one of their communities. They have soccer tournaments within their communities. They have a whole series of community creches, which are kind of like daycares, let's say, for the youth in their community. They really put a lot of emphasis upon building public halls throughout shack communities as a gathering site for anyone, not just for the local political bodies of the ANC. So that's a number of the ways in which Abahlali and the shack dwellers have really reinterpreted how space and place operate in South Africa and in shack communities.
And that's very, very important to understand those continuities and also look at some of the tools and some of the mechanisms that movements and the shack dwellers are doing in South Africa, and also how they relate to other movements that are going on in South Africa. And here, the question that I wanted to look at before we kind of wrap this up and move into a broader scope into the African world, I wanted to know what are some of the relationships that are created. And here I'm thinking about Fees Must Fall. I'm thinking about the Black First, Land First movement. I'm thinking about the economic freedom fighters. What are some of the relationship that are the continuities or the interdependence or interconnectedness that that this movement in particular have with other movements in South Africa?
Yeah, so that's been important for the shack dwellers since they first emerged in 2005. They're constantly thinking about ties to other struggles, not just the need to expand their own movement, but how to be in dialogue with other movements. And they situate themselves, I would say, in a really impressive way globally. A lot of other movements struggle to do this. It's difficult to think about what's going on at the national level in conversation with what's going on at the local level just in and of itself. So it's impressive that they think even more expansively on the global level. And I would say that they've been in dialogue directly or indirectly with a whole range of interesting alter globalization movements that have emerged in the late 90s and early 2000s, movements like the Zapatistas in southern Mexico, as another kind of rural movement fighting for land in part, the MST in Brazil, the autonomous movements, urban movements in Argentina that were organizing through assemblies, um, through movements and organizations in Haiti, through homeless people's movements in the United States. So they've really been reading and sometimes in direct conversation with all of these struggles around the world, and they visited many of these places. They've visited Palestinians in the West Bank to understand their struggle and how they also fight against home demolitions when the Israeli military might move in to demolish Palestinian homes. So I would say that's the first scale on which the shack dwellers are thinking about ties with other struggles. On a much more concrete level, let's say at the local level, they've participate and have participated in a range of different convergences with other struggles in the country. Initially, I think they were part of an alliance with the anti-eviction campaign in Cape Town. This was a movement fighting government evictions from public housing in the city of Cape Town, with the landless people's movement, primarily in the outskirts of Johannesburg, which was really bringing to the foreground questions of land and dispossession, both rural and urban. So they formed alliances with groups like that, and unfortunately, those early alliances kind of didn't persist, in part because, as you know, movements really struggle with limited resources just to keep themselves alive. Many of those organizations are no longer totally active, but they've maintained a kind of open dialogue. The other thing that they've done is create alliances at all sectors and levels of society. So while they are very critical of intellectuals and professionals and government officials who want to represent them or to solve their problems for them, this has been a constant critique in the movement in the name of their insistence upon their own ability to determine what the problems are and to address them. They nonetheless have consistently reached out to those very same people in the hopes that some of them, the best of them, might work with the shack dwellers rather than on their behalf. So some of the most successful examples of this have been their alliance with progressive and radical lawyers who have managed to challenge legislation at the provincial level in the province where they're located, primarily is KwaZulu-Natal on the Indian Ocean. That's where the city of Durban is. And there was a law proposed that was going to basically facilitate the speed up of the eradication of informal settlements, right? What the government calls shack communities, especially in the lead up to the 2010 World Cup. The government was interested in, quote unquote, cleaning up its cities and not having tourists witness the shack settlements that are pervasive throughout the country. And so they wanted to facilitate their ability to really remove poor shack communities at will. And they were passing new legislation to do that. Abahlali, in alliance with a whole series of progressive lawyers and nonprofit organizations, brought a case that they eventually took all the way up to the Constitutional Court, and they won that case, overturning that law, which was being seen as a model for the country as a whole and was already being proposed in other provinces. And they've even tried to create alliances at the local level with members of government. Once again, even though they consistently attack all the political parties, right? At almost all of their rallies, you'll hear them say, down with the ANC, down with the IFP, down with the DA, right? Down with all of these political parties, because they have all shown themselves to be more interested in their own survival and in the kind of patrimonial networks that are set up through political parties of enrichment for party members. They nonetheless have consistently been willing to sit down with those same political party leaders in the belief and the hope that maybe within these parties there might be some good individuals who insist upon understanding how Abahlali works and maybe working with them. So they've had moments when they've opened up that dialogue. They continue to be interested in it. Their voice has been so prominent that local ANC officials, including the new mayor in Durban, Zandile Gumede, promised in the lead up to her being elected mayor that she would kind of solve the problems, the tensions between Abahlali and the local government, that she would sit down with them, she would bring them to the table. So they were hopeful about this. Unfortunately, since coming to power in 2016, she seems to be continuing more of the same, and so they've denounced her for that as well. But that's what's interesting about Abahlali. For me, one of the many things is that their conception of autonomy, right, self-government, the insistence upon their own democratic structures rather than the states, doesn't necessarily have to come or let's say replace the government's form of intervention. Their autonomy, they think, can come alongside a dialogue and a working together with the state, government officials, NGOs, intellectuals, as long as those other officials and organizations recognize and respect that autonomy at the same time. It's not an autonomy that wants to secede from society to produce their own utopian enclave separate from the rest of the world. Really at the center of their ethic is also kind of this principle of encounter, the need to work with others and build alliances with others, but on the basis of mutual respect, right, for your governing processes and your own democratic decision-making structures.
No, that's very, very important because there's some deep cultural components here about working within, of course, Ubuntu, that we have the famous philosophical foundation of I am because we are, that we know of, that is famous and, that comes out of South Africa, but also in different other manifestations across the continent itself. These are very, very important. This conversation was very, very important. What are some ways that people can get more information about this particular movement that you can give our listeners to be able to go to look at?
I mean, the best one is probably their website. It's abahlali.org, and I'll spell that out. It's ABAHLALI.org. They are constantly writing their own analyses of what's going on, issuing press reports, uploading pictures from their various actions to that website. It's a tremendous resource, I would say, and the main resource for understanding what Abahlali is about. In addition to that, as I mentioned, they're often invited for gatherings, for convergences, and to give talks, to go on tour in other parts of the world. They've been to the U.S. a couple different times, so keep an eye out for that. They may show up in your local community, your local radical bookstore, at a university campus, and you get the chance to kind of talk with them in person.
I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today about this very, very important and often unheard in the dominant narrative of movements out of Africa, but across the world. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you.
We were just listening to a recent conversation I had with Yousuf Al-Bulushi of Gosher College in Baltimore, Maryland, about the language and praxis of decolonization through the reclamation of land and dignity in South Africa's shack dwellers and landless movements. We were looking at the Durban shack dwellers movement. Starting this past May 16th, the community of Buenaventura, along with communities in the Choco region of Colombia, launched a general strike demanding that the Colombian government meet the basic human rights to water, education, health, culture, land, and freedom from racism and violence. The strike caused businesses to close, roadblocks were set up at several points along the main road, and peaceful protesters chanted, sang, danced, and banged cooking pots to call attention to the desperate situation. According to a recent report from the Black Alliance for Peace, released June 12th, after many hours of dialogues and negotiation, an agreement was reached in the early hours of Tuesday, June 6th, bringing an end to the 22-day strike in Buenaventura, Colombia. The strike in the mainly Afro-descendant and indigenous city on Colombia's Pacific coast was an inspirational reminder of how collective, local level, and people-centered human rights processes can challenge economic powers and liberal politics, according to Ajamu Baraka. Next, we will hear a report on what happened and prospects of this agreement from Afro-Colombian human rights activist Charo Mina Rojas of Black Communities Process in Colombia, an international working group, and of the Afro-Colombian Solidarity Network. Enjoy the rest of the program.
First of all, I would like to thank you, you all, for being here and for having me here. It's always a pleasure and honor to be able to address our issues in front of people that we know that care and has been extremely in solidarity with our struggle. So thank you very much. Talking about resistance and particularly the walk and resist, I'm just bringing an example of that just happened, and here is a document that summarizes what happened in Buenaventura, and I will talk a little bit about that as an example of African tradition and resistance. I will mention that for us, part of the African tradition has been always resistance, has been collectiveness, the sense of community, the extended family, the protection, the sustainability. And some of the things that Sia mentioned and elaborate resonate a lot of me, thinking in this case of Buenaventura and thinking in our struggle and how we organize and what are some of our practices in Colombia, particularly with my organization, the Black Communities Process. I'm just going to start very briefly. I'm going to go really fast on this, but I like to always remind people, even if know about Colombia, that Colombia is a country with 46 million people, and 10 of those 46 million people are Black people, right? 26%, although the census in 2005 said that we were only 10%, we count ourselves as 26% or more due to different studies and research that has been done, that we self-recognize ourselves as Black people in different backgrounds, right? Afro-Colombians, people from Raizales, which are from San Andres and Providencia, the ones in the Cartagena, Palenque people, but we are Black people and we are 26%, third of the largest population in the Americas. We are located mostly in these areas, brown here, where we also have collective titles, and I will mention that later. Collective titles in those areas, that's the majority of the population located there, but we are all over the country in different communities, different sizes of communities, different sizes of presence, and active and organized and politicized presence. Campus. We have a legal framework. One of those is the Law 70 signed in 1993 that allowed us to recognize us in our ancestral territories to be collectively titled. And collective title is for us very important because it's a way to protect the territories from what is one of our major challenges, and is the economic interests that are located on those territories. We also have through Law 70 the territorial authorities, the community councils, which are our autonomous authorities on those territories. The community councils have the responsibility for the environmental administration and care of the territories, and have to build protective plans, or we call it planes de vida, like life plans, that help us to protect and continue the sustainability and the environmental protection of the territories. So we have over 6 million hectares of land titled collectively. I believe it's around 40 million acres of land, and those mostly in those areas. And we have more than 120 community councils of these local authorities, ethnical authorities. A series of international legal framework also that we stick to it, particularly the ILO 169, that allow us to demand the free prior consultation and consent, which means that whatever is going to be dictated, done in our territories has to pass through a process of consultation with the communities and these local authorities, our autonomous authorities, and has to be a consent to do these things in the territories. And this is a framework that we also use to create protection and help us to protect and prevent certain policies, economic policies mostly, and large-scale projects in the territories. And you can keep on. The roots of violence, I will summarize this on racism and the economic interests that are in the territories. Those are the main elements of the violence and the reasons for violence in Colombia. The internal armed conflict in Colombia has these roots in the economic interests, the neoliberal policies, they open up to neoliberalism in Colombia, and the racism that exists that is not recognized. And here is one of the main, in the center of the issues that have brought Buenaventura, if you keep pushing that has brought Buenaventura to the 22-day strike I will mention in a minute. Colombia has 17 free trade agreements signed, one of them with the United States, signed in 2011. Many of you helped us to do very heavy activism against the signing of that free trade agreement. It was signed anyway by President Obama. After in his campaign he said that he won't. But that has brought to this particular area in Colombia, Buenaventura, which was a minor port and now is the most important port in the region, has brought a tremendous amount of violence in the country against black people, in this area against black people. This is an area, this is a port with 500,000 people, that's right, 500,000? 500,000, right.
Yeah.
500,000 people, mostly black, 90% of the population in Buenaventura is black. It's, as I say, the most important port on the region, is the center of the development and the paveway for the development of the 17 free trade agreements that Colombia has signed already, and therefore there are 17 really large-scale development projects in that small area, particularly 2 of them for the expansion of the port and the development of tourist project that is going to displace, is forcing to displace 7 neighborhoods, several thousand people from the gentrification of the main area, the central area of the port. And 80% of this territory is compromised with these large-scale projects. Here is the difference between, the systemic violence rooted in profit against human rights. Buenaventura is considered the new capital of horror, is how BBC called it in 2014, after discovering that in Buenaventura there were the so-called shopping houses, casas de pique, places where paramilitary groups and armed groups will bring people alive and cut them in pieces. Most of these people were community leaders and people that were opposed to the development that the government was bringing to Buenaventura. It has been badly counted that over 167,000 people have been internally displaced and dispossessed in that area, and over 7,000 people, and it's not well counted, obviously, have been killed, violently dead since 2000. But what the government presents is the money and the wealth that developing Buenaventura is going to bring to the community, meaning this is no black community. It's not the black people in this community who is going to receive these benefits, right? 70% of the imports in Colombia pass through Buenaventura. Over $7 billion per year are produced through this activity, for activity in Buenaventura. Only 3%, less than 3%, goes back to Buenaventura and is not necessarily for water, for health, for roads, for education of the people, reason which people was on a strike for 22 days. And finally comes the strike, and this was a strike that was very well organized and planned since 2000, for 4 years, basically. One initial mobilization happened in 2014. That mobilization led to an agreement with the government to provide, to resolve issues of health, of water. Buenaventura is a city that has no water. People has water only half of the year. It's cut off constantly. So people have to collect rainwater. They don't have drinkable water. There are no sewage systems. The only hospital was closed a year ago because corruption. People has 2 private hospitals that are obviously very expensive, and they have to drive 3 hours to the main city, Cali, to get any medical assistance. So agreements were made for resolving these issues, and 4 years later, the people is in even worse conditions. So they decided to strike, but it was planned for 4 years. One of the reasons to don't do it earlier was because Buenaventura was completely encroached by these paramilitary and very violent groups. So now they put together this strike with these 8 demands, right, about health, education, healthy environment, the respect of the territorial rights, recreation, etc. Very peaceful. There are families out there closing the roads, with cultural activities, dancing, singing, the kids playing on the streets, all that. And the response of the government was that's actually a video. If you click on it, it probably plays. It was a very vicious, violent response. This started on May 16. By May 19, the special riot forces came into Buenaventura. 3,300 armed groups, between army, military, police, and the special riot forces came into this small town, surrounded it, and started attacking people with tear gas, with rubber bullets. What bullet? Those ones. And some stuff that they shoot to directly that leaves a big sting on you, but it's very, very painful. Stuff like that, and they were attacking, and you can see this is kind of the massive attack that is like all smoke, that is tear gas. But the worst part of this is that they start coming to 2-3 in the morning, from 2 or 3 in the morning to 9 in the morning, they will come with these massive attacks by air, although the president has denied it, but there are the videos and the testimonies for that, by air and by land, with this tear gas, throwing tear gas in the neighborhoods while people was sleeping. So we have over 300, we have already documented over 300 people injured, mostly elder people, injured by this tear gas and some of the rubber bullets, because when people walk outside, they will shoot people. Some people were shot actually with real bullets, and 2 people ended up dead in this process. Over 60 children have been severely affected by the gas, the tear gas, with very serious implications, considering that there is no health assistance in the town, so everybody had to be rushed to Cali. But people finally managed, thanks to the pressure. You saw the amount of people that were on the streets. I mean, every single day after this massive attack, people will go again to the streets in a peaceful way to say, we are here and we won't give up until we are here and we reach our agreement. Finally, there was an agreement that part of the agreement, some of the elements of the agreement are on this, so I recommend that you have it and read it, but the main agreement is that it's going to be created a specific fund that is going to be managed and monitored by people So it's not going to be managed by the national authorities, no, the local authorities. It's going to be selective people that is going to be managing this fund. The people is going to monitor the use of those resources. A 10-year development plan is going to be formulated that includes all these demands that they have here in health education. Some have been prioritized to be responded immediately, like health, like water, for instance, with over 1.5 billion pesos. And people continue to be organized, and discussion tables with the authorities as how this development plan is going to be put together, how these immediate response are going to be evolving. They continued on these tables of discussion and negotiation and formulation of plans to develop the agreement. So that is a strong experience of resistance, but also of the wake up of people that were for a really long time absorbing all this violence, not only the armed violence by the armed groups, but the state economic violence, which is something that we want to raise up awareness about it, because the most egregious violence in Colombia is not used by the armed groups, it's by the state. It's economic and it's armed and it's a criminal action.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms, email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com, or follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist, Moiza Muntali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent, Funa Ngunda, senior researcher and content contributor, Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technology, and creative director is Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Shows are archived weekly on SoundCloud. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.